the network for the AV industry.
What are you listening to?
This
is AV.
This
is AVNation.
This is AVNation.
A state of control.
This is A State of Control, episode number 4. Scope of What? Recorded Monday, May 20th, 2013. This is A State of Control. Welcome. Thank you so much. This is the control-centric podcast put on to you by the fine folks at AVNation. My name is Tim Albright. I'm your host for the day. With us is Steve Greenblatt. Steve is the chief everything at Control Concepts. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Tim. How are you?
Doing well. Also with us is Doug Santo. Doug is the senior consultant at Shen, Milsom, and Wilke. How are you, sir?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. Also is Steve Samson, Director of Business Development at Crestron. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Tim. Great to be here.
And last but not least, live from the Hamptons, which is unusual, our wonderful Uncle Richie. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. I'm bi-coastal this week, so, extrapolate what you will from that.
I have nothing. You on the West Coast, or in the East Coast, rather, has got to be interesting, though.
It's this whole Inception thing, that's going on right now.
Yeah. If you don't know, Uncle Richie is actually from California, Silicon Valley, so he's a little bit out of his element this morning. So the sun, actually just rose over the water this morning instead of setting on it. So sorry, it was a really bad joke. This month we're going to talk about we're going to talk about scope of works, and in the grand scheme of things, it's not the most exciting thing in the world. It's necessary, and it can be exciting for those of you who are involved in it. In my real job, my full-time job, I'm a technology manager for a community college around St. Louis, and I understand the need of scope of work, but I also understand that sometimes they're not the most exciting things in the world to read. But what we'll start off with this month is really kind of talking about how to develop a good one. What does it take, and not only from the commercial side, but also from the residential, and how you can get in tune with the client and maybe get them kind of on the same page and get them understanding exactly why the scope of work really does benefit them. So, Steve Greenblatt, we'll start off with you. What exactly is maybe one or two elements that you have to have in a good scope of work?
Well, a scope of work's pretty important, and I know mentioning it's not an exciting part. It's critical actually for a programmer, because a lot of what we do is create a user experience. And how do you define a user experience? It's something that's intangible, and looking at a system design without putting words to it, it's very hard for you to expect that you're going to get the desired outcome. And there needs to be some sort of a mechanism, and we've adopted a few, and we also have some different thoughts on how to go about getting that information. But there needs to be a way to be able to understand what the client is looking for, be involved in the conversation toward the beginning of a project, and hopefully assist the designer in defining how the system programming and design are going to be married, and then put together what needs to happen and really spell out your recipe for programming, let's say. And that trickles into many of the other aspects of a project, like setting the budget for a project and also defining the time frame for a project. So it is something that's critical because of the custom nature of what we do.
Doug, when you guys develop and start talking with different clients, whether that is the actual end user or it's an architect, What is your rule of thumb when it comes to bringing you guys in to help develop that scope of work? Like, where in the construction process do you recommend people bring guys like you or even Steve in?
We want to get involved at the very start of the project, even when they're space planning and just talking about how they're going to be using the space. That's really the most critical time for us to get involved, even from a control systems specification standpoint or a scope of work. Knowing exactly, how the users are going to be coming into the space, what type of users are going to be coming into the space, a lot of that determines, what's going to show up at the end of the day when they actually do walk into the space. And so we want to get involved, at the very beginning, before even, the walls are decided upon, so that we can know how many people are going to be in there and whether it's going to be regular users or people who are just seeing the system for the first time.
Rich, how easy is it, or is it easy at all to get in that early? Like Doug says, when they're even starting talking about space usage.
I think it depends. It really, if you're coming in as strictly a third-party programmer, you might not have that kind of input unless you're working in partnership with the designer. For full-service companies, either integrators or specifiers on the residential side, then potentially you already have your programmers in-house, and you are right at the beginning, during the plan stages. Me personally, I've been called in at the very last minute once everything was connected. I've also had projects that were 4-year build-outs on really large residences that I was there on day one. It was architect, general contractor, and then me. But that tends to be the exception. Often when we're dealing residentially, you are already taken into account a lot of givens in there. And if you can get it on the front end, we found that, there's some economies of scale and there's some savings there. But it's definitely a different animal in terms of a homeowner seeing the importance of specification as opposed to a corporate or educational or government. I mean, it's just more established in that side of the industry. Residential, we're slowly getting there, but really only towards the top end. In the middle and the lower end, there's just no budget for it. People are just buying hardware.
Yeah. Steve Samson, is there something that, what can Crestron, we're just in any manufacturer, but you work for Crestron, so let's talk about that, do to help guys like Doug or Rich and Steve get in on the front end? It's maybe something like your experience centers or your relationships with architects.
Yeah, you bet, Tim. Well, I think that the points that are already on the table are really right on the money. So as Rich was saying, the fact that the residential space is not nearly as organized yet as, for example, the commercial space is. So, when you have groups like Doug's that are on the highest level creating scopes of work and specifications for projects that can be followed from the beginning to the end, and to Doug's point, the earlier you begin, the better. I think the biggest thing that Crestron can do is to bring some of that discipline and some of that best practices concepts through to the high-end residential and mainstream space. And as Rich so well said, when you're on a large residential project, the type that Rich and his firm does regularly, a scope of work is very common and almost expected by the homeowner and the project managers that are involved in those kinds of projects. But as you come down into the more mainstream projects, as Rich said, it's quite often a project that's run off of an equipment list. The proposal is nothing more than a line list of gear with very little explanation to the owner about what will happen with their system and how they'll interact with it. And I think that's the greatest place where we can make a big difference as a group is in that area, at least from the manufacturer's perspective. Because when we look at pain points, places where we need to step in and bring our tech support people in and help to solve challenges and help dealers and others get projects on the right track, it tends to be in cases where there's not a scope of work, and it becomes a common denominator. So we see it very clearly, and To your point, Tim, I think we can do many things in terms of raising the level of awareness, not just with the highest degree of implementers that are out there, such as the people on this call, but also with the rank and file customers who don't know what they don't know, and make that more of an obvious thing that they should expect. We're working on that every day, Tim.
Okay, Doug, let's take you. When you guys start meeting with a client, again, whether that's the architect or the end user, walk me through how this scope of work gets developed. I mean, what are the steps here?
Sure. Well, before I do that, I just wanted to add one point. The reason why we want to get involved so early, it's really more of a matter of project management and kind of business efficiency, because we're all looking for those outliers. The things that are going to be unique to a specific user or a specific institution that we may not have seen before, because those outliers are the things that are going to make or break the project at the end of the day. You don't want to get to the end, not have met with the users, have them be flipping through touch panel pages and then say, why is this button here and it's not over here? This is how we, do it in the other campus locations that we didn't tell you about before, And so we want to identify that stuff from the get-go, like I said, as early as possible, so that you're not faced with going back and doing revisions later. And the sooner we get involved, the sooner we can identify those things, and they'll come up sooner and we can work through them. So that, it's a big reason behind it. And so in terms of our process, the way that we begin developing these scopes of work is asking exactly those types of questions. How many people are going to be in the space? What are you going to use it for? Are you going to be doing PowerPoint presentations? Are you going to be doing, lab work if it's an educational institution? If you're using, a document camera heavily because you're showing materials in real space, how is that going to be incorporated? And we really want to understand the usage of the system as a whole and what they intend to do with the system. And then we can write the scope of work around that to understand, what are the most frequently used activities, I'll call them, that they're going to be using the AV system for. And that's kind of the heart of the scope of work as we've come to see it, is, having these typical activities that users go to on a regular basis. Most of the time, in a lot of the institutions we see, it's just straight up presentation. Someone brings in a laptop, they have a PowerPoint, and they want to, show it on the screen. But we also, divide those activities into audio conferencing and video conferencing, and whatever else they might have that we don't know about. But those are the types of things that we want to identify and then write into the scope of work.
Steve Greenblatt, Doug mentions the regular use case scenario, right? And that makes sense. How do you get beyond that, though, and how do you accommodate, like he says, the unknown, the unusual situation or the unusual use case inside the scope of work?
Like Doug mentioned, I think that establishing that relationship and getting to know who the users are and having what I say to the users is, I have to understand your culture. I have to understand how you do business or how you plan to operate or what type of institution you are, so that I can help to suggest or recommend a solution and take the information that has been given and work alongside of somebody, whether it is a consultant or whether it's an integrator, and propose these are solutions that we have worked with and that we have provided in the past for people that are in a similar situation to what you're in. And we found that they've worked for these reasons, and have that back and forth dialogue. And it needs to be collaborative. It can't be something where we're just pushing out a solution, and it still needs to be customized. But I think that there are best practices that are important to fall back on and also use to educate. And I think it's important to make the user think too, because sometimes what they ask for isn't necessarily the best thing for them. So challenging and having that two-way dialogue, I think, is important. And then documenting, of course, and following up on this process to eventually create a sign-off that has enough definition to be able to get a program that is within 90% of being fully developed, and there's always going to be some margin for adjustment in the end.
Talk about sign-off for a second. Is it protection for you and for them, or is this more or less a document that says, yes, I am the owner or I'm the end user here, and I agree that what you said you were going to do, you've done? Is that what that is?
It needs to. I always look at it as something to fall back on. So we need to have a basis for what we're developing, and something that we can, if there is a concern or if there is a cause for a dispute, and typically doesn't get that far, but we at least have an agreed upon document that says this is where we started from, and this is what we both agreed to complete.
Rich, I'm going to come back to sign off for a second and ask all four of you guys, four of you guys that. Rich, real quick, what are your steps when you in your process for developing a scope, and is it different for dealing with architects as it is with end users?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting in that, and again, I'm dealing with a different animal, because I'm dealing with, when you're dealing with an organization or a school or a government building, people aren't necessarily emotionally invested in the system. It's where they work, and so it's a tool for them to get their job done. In residential, you're dealing in somebody's home, and you're dealing with it being kind of an extension of their personality, their style, their taste, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's not only are you dealing with the technical side, but you're almost dealing with the psychological side of things, which is, what does this person want to experience? And what we've always explained is that these automation systems are really just kind of the gateway drug to entertainment, to the visceral response. A song, a movie, your creature comforts, whether it's lighting, life safety, pool control, et cetera, et cetera. And so we take a little bit of a backwards approach, which is more of, we stay away from the technical elements initially, because we're going to have to get to that point, and we don't necessarily need to trouble them with it. But we go back into let's go through a day in the life of your house. Do you have children? Do you entertain? We go through all of the key use case points first, and establish, how do you think you're going to use it first? And one of the things that the guys were talking about a bit ago that kind of prompted me to think is that one of the issues that we're having with scope of work lately, and kind of nailing down a scope of work and defining it, is that a lot of products that are out there are being heavily marketed with much bigger advertising budgets than we use as, plug and play. Well, it just works. You buy a 99-cent app, and it just works. It auto-magically happens. And, where we're starting to see some of the pushback is having, instead of defining a scope of work, is defining what configurable means as opposed to custom. And they're two very, very distinct items that you have to draw that line through. And I think what Stephen was saying a little bit earlier is that you're looking at what are the make or break points in a project, and that's the real big one in terms of setting up a system, which is, are you looking for something that you're familiar with and we're kind of tweaking along the way? Are you looking for something that's uniquely yours? Because that makes a big difference in terms of where you get in terms of your sign off and where you're dealing with your design and your development. So for us, we deal, again, here's the California boy. It's more of a holistic approach.
Yes.
I got to make sure their chakras are right. Your Crestron's giving off the right green aura.
Tell me you don't program using feng shui.
Yeah, exactly. I never program with knives at my back, right?
Oh my!
I think that part of what Rich is also saying too is the fact that it's hard for the user who's never seen something like this before to understand it. So what is a way that you can give them a relatable concept, whether it's a demo or something that they can then use as a reference point. And I don't know, that's one of the problems that we tend to have, is that something on paper doesn't necessarily translate well into reality, because you have to be able to use your imagination or use some past experience to say, okay, I understand what you're talking about, and I understand what you're planning to do with this.
Steve's got a great point. That's exactly what we do. I mean, our first meeting is I bring in an iPhone, an iPad, and an iPad mini. And I have a demo server that runs out of my office that has I have a live system that actually controls my house. And then I also have kind of a dummy system where I can pull up derivatives and say, okay, this is what some people do. This is what other people do. Where do you find, and there's that tactile element of it. And again, I'm talking about Resi, where, people are going to be looking at, color palettes, or, do they like it portrait rather than they like it landscape? Do they want it big and flashy, or do they want it muted and minimalist? And going back to the tools in terms of scope of work, I mean, that's one of the big problems that we have, is that you almost have to program a system first and show it as a demonstration, as opposed to be able to do something where you can kind of emulate on the fly and let them, tinker around and play with. And that's something that's really always plagued us, is it's almost a chicken and the egg. How do you sell the system if you don't have something you can show? Well, how do you show it if you haven't sold the system? And I think what happens, I'm sure like Steve was talking about, is that the people who are more successful at generating a defined scope of work are able to effectively demonstrate what road you're going down, make some connections of I like it, I don't like it, so that first layer of expectations, it was said before, you don't know what you don't know. You're right. If somebody hasn't had an automation or an integrated control system, it's all brand new to them. So, when they see demos of, really cool whiz-bang stuff, well, maybe they haven't used it anywhere other than just pressing a few buttons and goes, wow, that's great. But they find out that, maybe after a week of living with it, it's a total pain in the butt. And so, the definition side of things, it's really tough to figure out, how much information do I give you from the beginning? Because at the same time, you almost wind up scaring them off too. It's a real tight line. So for us, we try to make it as personal as possible. We go through the use cases, we go through all the cliches, imagine, if you will, the day in the life when you walk through the door. What are the things that you normally do? Because that's really the purpose of an automation system, is to take everyday repeatable tasks and distill them down to one or two steps, and then have the tools to be able to jump off of that. And in there, then at that point, if we can kind of get them an idea of, how they think they're going to use it, then we can actually start writing it up and drafting the technical side of, okay, here's everything under the hood of how it works. But I'm still constantly trying. I mean, 20 years, and it seems like every project I have to take a new approach sometimes.
Well, let me ask, and this is for Steve or Rich or Doug even, is that it, then if that's the case then, and that can be for corporate or for Resi, would it be better served for you to either A, build in, buffers and both monetary buffers and time buffers to accommodate for those changes at the end, or would it be better to show them, give them the behind the scenes look as you're developing it? Here's maybe, the first stage of the programming. Do you like it? Yes or no? If yes, then you move on. If no, then we change it there.
Is that to me or to the guys?
That's to any of you three, consultant and programmer guys.
It's a toss-up.
The problem is, again, the first question people ask when you do that is, well, how much is it going to cost me? And if you're in a competitive bid situation, they may opt to deal with the company that hasn't considered it and feels that they can afford to be optimistic. And like Steve said, it's a toss-up. It's constant education. Where do you start? Typically you have to start with the project manager, the construction manager, and the architect. You have to start at that top level and hopefully get them educated in the point where, you wouldn't build this skyscraper without blueprints, right? So we're doing the same thing just with electronic code. We don't just, ready, fire, aim with this stuff. And it's a matter of establishing, there's value in that. The hard part is quantifying it and then saying, and by the way, yeah, you got to pay for this.
What we find a lot of times too in projects is that there's this period of acceptance where after 60 days we follow up, or there's part of the specification to do user preference adjustments, and this way it gives the client some feeling that they are going to have the ability to make some tweaks, something that they want to see a little different, or maybe doesn't work as well for them, or something that they forgot to add. I think a lot of it comes down to building an ongoing relationship. So these systems are not done when the project requirements are satisfied, but it's something that they can grow with. And a lot of times they don't know until they've used it for X amount of time what really is going to be best suited for them. And I think that we've seen a lot of opportunities because of that, because if they like the work that you've done, they'll call you back to do more and grow with them as they settle into their systems, or even do more systems like what's been done in the past. I think that what it comes down to is knowing whether the expectations are fulfilled, and if they have something in mind that they wanted, making sure that translated well. If they didn't necessarily have something in mind, then hopefully we've done a good job of extracting that information and providing them with a system that exceeded those expectations, and they will continue to grow with it.
I think Steve just broke down what is it, the 5 stages of grief, except in programming.
Nice.
The 5 stages of scope. Anger, bargaining, and then acceptance.
And finally, acceptance, right? Yeah. Tim, I wanted to jump in because you threw the question up to me too.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of thoughts, so it's going to be hard for me to keep them straight.
Okay.
We come in with the architect, and we very often get brought in through the architect, and we're not proposing directly to the client. And from the architect's perspective, when we write a proposal for the work that we do, and it's come up bringing in the process of even, I'll go so far as to say touch panel design, not just scope of work. And, from the architect's perspective, they don't see that as being part of the building that they're delivering at the end of the day. They are providing a structure, the infrastructure, and the interiors, and the pictures that they take of the building when it's done to show that the work they've done. They don't include pictures of the touch panel most of the time. The touch panels are off in those pictures, and it's not included from their perspective. But what we communicate to them over and over again is that they want a satisfied client, and this goes into that client satisfaction. So what we try to do is take in all the requirements ourselves and use the scope of work to translate that into the bid documents that we're also being hired to deliver, and make sure that the requirements get delivered to the people who are bidding on that design, because it's not something that we can establish from the outset without actually, in a lot of ways, providing the touch panel design specifically to the people who are bidding on it. So there's a little bit of that tension because the bid process, from our perspective anyway, is involved in that, right? We have to draw a line, and we don't design the touch panels 100%. We'll specify them, we'll write a scope of work, but we don't design the touch panels until after the bid has been awarded. And so that impacts our timeline and basically demands that the scope of work is included. And I wanted to try to tie this back to your original question to Steve, in terms of how important is the sign-off and, what does it mean for you? I see it tying back to 3 important factors. One is, we talked about it already, identifying the pain points. If you don't at least have the conversation with them and get them to say, look, is there anything that we haven't talked about? When you come home and, listen to the music every single day, that's something that we need to know about so that we make that the priority in your interface design, right? So identifying the pain points is number one. And number two is very similarly forcing the conversation, because from our process, again, we're very closely involved with the architect or, facilities person, someone who's responsible for the project. But very frequently, they're not tied into the same requirements that the user has as we are in terms of what we expect those requirements to be. We're not going to go to the architect and get the same feedback that, they listen to music every day when they come home. The architect just doesn't usually have those conversations with them. And so we need something that forces the conversation. Being able to go to the architect and say, we need to get sign off on the scope of work for the control system allows us to do that. It gives us a reason to go have that conversation with them directly. And the final one, does relate to what you asked about, which really is protection for the people who are responsible for those systems. The worst case scenario is that someone leaves the team and they had all the information in their head and they knew exactly how it was going to go. And now that person's gone and, we're stuck and we don't know, what it was that the user wanted. So we need to be able to capture it in some type of documentation just so that, again, we can have a satisfied client at the end of the day and we don't have to go back, have the conversation again and spend, more time that the project budget doesn't really allow for. So that's, I know that's a lot, but I'm hoping I answered the question with all that somewhere.
No, you definitely did. I appreciate it. Real quickly, you're listening to A State of Control. That gentleman right there is Doug Santo. Also with us is Steve Greenblatt and Stephen Samson, and Rich Fregosa from Fregosa Design. Mr. Samson, this is for you, and we'll kick it off, and then we'll go around to the other guys. When it comes to developing these scopes of work, and these guys have demonstrated very eloquently some of the pitfalls, there is going to be inevitably a loose or an undefined scope of work. It's a scope of work, all right. This is what I want, and this, that, and the other. But let's say that it's not as fully developed as it could have been. How does that impact manufacturers like Crestron?
Well, that's a good question, Tim. And maybe I'll start answering that by saying that what I'm hearing and what we've found from the manufacturer perspective and my time as an integrator before my time at a manufacturer is that this is really all about managing expectations. And I think Steve and Rich and Doug all kind of articulated that in different ways. But there are so many ways, as Steve pointed out, to articulate or manage those expectations. The scope of work is the obvious central point, the agreement, the contract that clearly points out what are the expectations. And to a large degree, it's a document that allows everybody to know when the project is done or supposed to be done. And with that being said, there is no one common scope of work that's perfect for everyone or every project. And Rich said that quite nicely. And in some cases, you do have to handle it on a project-by-project basis. But in some cases, it may be appropriate to use the proposal itself as the scope of work, so long as it's not just a list of equipment, but there are very clear definitions of what each piece of equipment is supposed to be doing, what will happen in each room or area or section, and in a language that can be understood and digested by the person who's signing off on it on the end. And in some cases where that's loosely defined, back to your question, it's a matter of sometimes backfilling that void and finding a way to satisfy the customer before things go too far off the tracks. And where we see it at Crestron from a manufacturer's perspective is, in the first case, it's usually one of our dealers or resellers calling for tech support and looking for a way to solve a problem or create a solution to something that they hadn't predicted or hadn't come across before, either with Crestron's own hardware or with some combination of things. In other cases, in the extreme cases, it's actually an end user calling to our customer support line looking for help, asking for manufacturer support in a situation. And we actually, in those cases, will ask the dealer the Crestron dealer, reseller, or the CSP like Steve Greenblatt for the scope of work, so we can understand what was explained to the customer, what their expectations are, so that we can, in a sense, be a mediator, or maybe more than a helpful hand in helping to decipher some of those things in a very neutral and positive way. So it happens, and when it does, I think the objective is for us all to work together as a community to help the end customer get what they were looking for, what they were hoping for in the end.
Doug, when it comes to developing the scope of work and getting the client, the end user, whoever that is, whether it's the architect, the facilities manager, or the actual end user, how do you get it to the point where you know that this is a bad way to say that you know that they know? In other words, that you have full confidence that they understand the language that you're talking about?
It's a really good question. We generally produce 3 sets of documents that go out to bid for integrators and programmers. Sometimes it's the same thing. Those documents are our equipment list, our drawings, and our written specification. We generally don't include touch panel pages in any of those documents because, to the point I brought up earlier, it's not a part of our process. It's a separate scope of work. We want the programmers to be doing that touch panel design and production. So what we usually end up doing is writing into the specification, in English language. The user is going to walk into the space. They're going to touch the panel to wake it up, and it's just straight up verbiage. We will also use bullet points to describe a menu hierarchy to show the buttons that are going to be available on a page, and that's what we've found to be the most efficient way to communicate the needs of the system. And if there's any of those pain points that are outliers that don't fit into it, again, we can just write those up in verbiage. And in terms of getting the client to understand what's happening, we just read through it with them. We'll write it up, we send it out to them for review, and then we schedule a meeting and we sit down and we say, okay, you had a chance to read through it. Does our, reflection of what we talked about match what you expect to get? And that's really kind of the sign-off process. And if they have any questions, we go over those questions. Sometimes we have to revise what we wrote. Oftentimes we have to revise what we wrote. We very rarely get it right the first time around, but again, it's because it's difficult for them to picture in their mind exactly what we're talking about. And sometimes, we do have to pull up sample touch panels, but we don't include them in our documentation unless it's a client standard, right? If there are touch panels that a specific institution uses all the time, then we do include those. So I'll revise my previous statement. But Shen, Milsom, and Wilke does not produce touch panel pages to go out as part of our documentation. Although I'm sure there's some rare exception that I don't know about somewhere where a client paid us more to do something than what we we usually do. But yeah, generally it's just straight up English language, and we sit down and talk it through, and sometimes we pull up sample touch panel pages to walk them through that as well.
Well, Doug actually brought up a good point, which is, again, they're on the consultant side, and so, again, kind of who we're kind of catering to are going to be companies who are either integrators or programmers who might be part of a bid scope. Do you go through this, and this is to Doug, do you go through this with everybody that's on the short list once they get passed, and you walk them through each time? Are you expecting them to know it? And then, basically collaborate with you at that point? One of the things that I think that newer integrators or newer programmers run into is they go back into they don't know what they don't know. So, they're coming in, they get a spec, their eyes get big, and they're like, holy cow, we could be involved in this. And they haven't necessarily had the experience and been through the ups and downs, say like Steve and myself have, over the course of a couple of decades, where we just know where things are going to go south on us.
Right.
Is it, when you're generating the scope of work, do you factor in, in a bid situation that, how you're going to have to explain the scope of work, and does that get factored into your billing? Because again, this all boils down to how you're going to get paid, who's going to pay you, and making sure you get final payment. And so this is one of the ones that I'm constantly battling with, which is, if I take it too far, then, I'm head and shoulders above everybody else, and potentially I price myself out of the project only because I know what the project actually costs. And somebody else might afford to be optimistic, and then you get the conflict and everything else. And, we talked about it. Sometimes the best job, I think we talked about it on the last show, sometimes the best job is the one you walk away from.
Yeah.
And so for me, like I said, I'm curious, sitting going, all right, you wrote your spec, say you got 10 people on your short list. Do you meet with all of them and you kind of blanket it through, or do you just wait until they get back to you and say, oh, have you considered this? That's kind of the difference between, a bid spec and a collaborative spec at that point. And then who gets involved, altogether.
Sure. I would love to take it wouldn't be the whole call, but I would love to go through the entirety of what our process is, if not just so that we could talk about what SMW's process is the whole time. But in terms of the bid process, that specification that I referred to earlier, that goes out in the documents, and we, to a large extent, have to depend on the contractors reading through those documents in detail. We do, on occasion, point out specific differences from specification to specification because, there's plenty of contractors who get our documents all the time because, they're very good contractors. We work with them a lot, and there's a lot of those contractors, right? We're independent consultants. That's what we do. And so they're familiar with our specification, and there's a risk to some extent that they're going to look at the certain sections of the specification because they know that that's where, the new stuff is. They're going to ignore some of the other specifications. And if we think that that's going to happen on a specific job, we'll point it out to them and we'll say, look, this is different this time. You have to be aware of this. And, we also have an RFI process in the bid where we give the contractors an opportunity to basically question our design. And, we rely on them reviewing these types of details, not just the control system scope of work, but everything that's involved in the project, and coming back to us and saying, look, you guys really understand this, that, and the other thing, because on the contractor side, they want to make sure that they are bidding in a level competitive playing field, and we want to make sure of that too. We don't want one person to have an advantage over the other. We want everyone to have the same understanding of what it is that they're buying. And if someone comes back to us and says, I think this is particularly challenging, and I want to make sure of what you're asking for, we will then send out what's basically an addendum to our bid documents to all of the people that are on the list and say, look, this is clarification for, paragraph 2, subsection C, or whatever it is. And that's how we try to get around the fact that, people may have different levels of understanding in the bid. And sometimes, we're not talking about bids here, we're talking about scopes of work, but not every contractor puts the same level of attention into the bid. And that's a risk that, is very hard for us to control because that's kind of on their side of it. And so, we don't want that to happen, and we try to make people aware of everything that we know about as much as we can. But that's kind of the nature of the bid process, I think, and that's always going to be a challenge.
Steve, again, this brings up another question. Is like, I know that Crestron has a tech sales department, and so do, some of the other manufacturers. How often do you guys buy in on that? Again, it's these examples of Doug writes a spec. Do you buy in at that point? Do you review? And then, from a manufacturer standpoint, I know that I call and I kind of verify some things on my own scope of works, but again, I'm not building a stadium. I'm building a house. There's two different, it's two completely different use cases at that point. But, from a manufacturer standpoint, what are the tools or the services that are available in terms of kind of refining scope of work so that, guys don't paint themselves into a corner?
Yeah, great question, Rich. We have a number of services that we have available that groups like SMW, I believe, use fairly regularly, or at least when they do, we look at what they're bringing in on an expert level. And so to answer the first part of your question, That's where we begin. And so whether it comes from your group, from SMW, or from Steve Greenblatt, we really rely on the expertise of you and how you understand your customer and the project's requirements. And from there, we can then provide constructive feedback. So our tech sales team is growing all the time, and we have many experts in that group that can answer questions about the various different product categories like digital media, control, touchscreen development, networking, fusion deployments, all sorts of things. And in addition to that, we often find that our tech support team is also called upon, because even though they're not in the role of pre-sale support like the tech sales team is, the tech support team tends to know some of the gotchas to be careful about. And in addition to that, Steve was a part of our Crestron Services Provider Advisory Board, and that's a relatively new group that's been in existence now, Steve, for what, about 2 or 3 years now, I suppose?
Yeah, I would say about 3 or 4, something like that.
Right. And one of the initiatives that we took on about 2 years ago, when Steve was part of that the original founding group, was the development of a scope of work example. And that document is actually on the Crestron website under the CSP, or Crestron Services Provider section. And really, that's just the beginning. This CSP group and the advisory board is working on some other resources that are available not only to services providers as a community, but also to dealers and even end users. And so in time to come, we'll have things like checklists and questionnaires and things that will help everybody to understand what it is that they should be looking for when defining a proper scope of work, and how to properly set expectations first and foremost. But great question, Rich. Thank you.
All right.
And a lot of
Go ahead.
Based on
Good, Steve.
what Steve was just saying is a lot of what is in that library is proven tools, things that have been used by other independent programmers and probably other integrator programmers that have been collaborating with independents. And what it does is it not only is a way of gathering information, but also a way of presenting to a user what's possible and things that they should consider, and whether it's a questionnaire or some way of defining the system for them. It gives a mechanism for making what we do tangible.
All right, guys. Real quickly, we're going to wrap this up with one last question. It's kind of fitting that I want to talk about sign-off at the end. But Steve Samson, we'll start with you. The way that I view sign-off, and again, I'm the typical end user-ish technology manager at a college. I don't see it as this giant shield protecting the integrator, nor do I see it as one that or even the consultant, or one that protects necessarily the end user. But in my mind, it kind of protects both parties, right? From Crestron or from the manufacturer standpoint, how do you guys see the sign-off sheet? And you know what? We've gone through the scope of work, and you guys have said you've done pretty much what the scope of work said you were going to do. Yes, I am satisfied, and I signed the piece of paper. Do you guys feel that's necessary, or is it just they paid their final bill, and so that's sign-off enough?
Well, if we look at it from a best practices perspective, Tim, I think that the whole idea of a sign-off sheet is really critical. And what we've seen from those who've been doing this for a long time and really have perfected their scope of work process, there's some minimum ingredients that are part of this whole sequence, and one of those is the sign-off sheet. And it's really the way to bring the customer to a point where they agree that everything that they expected has been done, and from there you can move on with enhancements and new things. And really, it's a win-win-win. It's a win for the dealer and the CSP if there's one involved, the owner, the manufacturer, and everybody, because this way there's acknowledgement that that things have been defined and they've been checked as the process is going along. I think Rich pointed that out. There's kind of an evolutionary process that happens on any given project, but when you finish that, when you get to that finish line, it's a pretty powerful point when you can have somebody sign that final sheet to say, yes, everything that we agreed to is done, and from here on out, we'll be in the maintenance mode or the addition mode or whatever things may happen. And we found that in the end, it's great for everybody because now it's actually a way to create more revenue, not the opposite. So it pays for itself in spades in the end.
Mr. Fregosa, when it comes to dealing with the residentials, first of all, is the sign-off sheet important? And secondly, if it is, where in the process does that happen? Is it once you're done, or do you give them maybe a week or two or a month to kind of live with the system?
Well, God knows, some people call it efficient. I call it lazy when it all comes down to it. I use the sign-off sheet as the user manual anyway. That's kind of my feeling, is that I need to generate kind of a user document after for them to be able to refer to. So they kind of morph one into the other to begin with. And so, you've got step one, which is okay, here's the things we've agreed to. We're good. Here's, and again, we show them on the touch panel at the same time. If you forget, we've got a little index and it's like, oh, here, that's how you play Spotify. Oh, yeah, I remember now. So, we wind up kind of double dipping in that respect with it. I got to say first, though, I feel like I'm on Meet the Press. This is like the most polite panel point counterpoint discussion I think we've had. I think we're like a real podcast or something.
Oh, don't get crazy.
Let's put on a show.
Good.
Sorry, you can't have drunk Uncle Richie around too much, right?
It's only well, I guess it's afternoon, so yeah. It's again, I think if you're doing your due diligence, that sign-off sheet at the very least brings up, how do I do this questions, or, oh, I thought it was going to do this questions, and nip it in the bud. Hopefully you dealt with it beforehand, but if you haven't, at least then, you're hoping that you got everybody together and you're able to then reiterate, here's what we'd agreed to. I have no problems adding it or changing it, or, oh gosh, that fell through the cracks. We're sorry. It keeps everybody hopefully in friendly terms, I guess, at that point. And then again, like I was talking about, for us, then once everything checks out, in Uncle Richie fashion, we do save as, and it becomes the user manual. Well, it's kind of like Doug said, though. It forces you guys to have that conversation, right? It forces that what could turn into an uncomfortable conversation into, we need to have this conversation so everybody's on the same page and everybody has the same expectation.
And it's tough because nobody likes pointing fingers,
no.
And the larger a project gets, the more layers and just, people are involved. It's just it's the nature of the beast. And so you're not only talking about your relationship with your client, but you're possibly talking about the relationship with all your partners in the project, the GC, the electrician, the networking people, if you're a third-party programmer, the AV integrator you're working with, you stand the risk of getting a lot of people upset at each other at the end of a project. The less clear you are, the more chances for conflict. And, again, kind of pulling out the West Coast vibes, man. It's, you just got to keep everybody mellow. And scopes of work do that. They're a pain in the butt, they totally are. I don't like writing them. I'd much rather wing it and just kind of, do my little jazz thing. But most people don't like it that way. So, you've got to define it, and you got to put the work in the beginning, because as Doug and Steve have reiterated, and Steve squared, it saves you at the end. It really does. You have so much less work to do at the end. Instead of you get to the end point and find out you've got a whole ton more work to do because you didn't do your homework on the front end. And just went, like I said, off of, oh, well, here's the parts list. Okay, X amount for programming. Here's what we do. And then the questions come up, and you never finish projects. That's the downside, I think, with scopes of work. If you don't get them done, you never finish the job because there's always something. And, it makes it tough to run a business that way.
Yeah, I've heard that more than once, where the never-ending project. Doug, from you guys' standpoint, from SMW's standpoint, talk a little bit about the sign-off sheet.
Sure. One thing that I don't think I talked about that we do in the process when we have to is describing why it's there. There's a difference between saying I want a car and saying I want a Mini, and I want a Mini in yellow. And if you say I want a Mini and then later you say I want a Mini in yellow, that's usually fine. But if you say I want a Mini and then later say I want a Humvee, then you have to have the conversation that says these two things are very different from each other and they don't cost the same amount of money. And it's part of the education process for our clients a lot of time. Well, not a lot of time. Most of the time we work with people who are familiar with sign-off sheets. But for people who aren't, we definitely have that conversation and we say, look, this is for your protection so that you're telling them what you're buying, because you don't want to just say, I want a car. You want to say, I want a Mini. And if you know that you want it in yellow, you want to say that too. And it's also for the contractor's protection, whether that's an independent programmer or an integrator who does the programming in-house. It's for their protection too, so that they can have the conversation. And usually when people are aware of that process, there's a little bit of push and pull when you go back and say, well, you're asking for a Humvee and you originally asked for a Mini, because especially in the world of control system scope of works, that can be debatable, right? I mean, we're talking about something that's very intangible. It's a user interface, and you can be very specific with it, but you can also leave a lot of detail out if you don't have the information or you don't spend the time getting all the details that are necessary to specify that. And so that's where it fits in our process in terms of, it's education for the client and it's protection for both parties.
All right, good words there. Mr. Greenblatt, you have the last word from Control Concepts and from your standpoint. Talk a little bit about how important the sign-off sheet is.
Well, it's certainly important to delineate the completion of a project. But I don't necessarily. We actually are one to not necessarily have a sign off per se. We have an understanding that we've completed what our deliverable is, and hopefully we've set the tone and built the foundation throughout the process so that at the time of completion there are no surprises, and as long as the system is working, then we've met the objective. I think one of the key elements is managing the project along the way. I think we've said it a couple of different ways throughout this show, is to make sure that as a group and as a team we're keeping the project on course, and because varying from that scope will impact many things. It won't just be more work or free functionality or whatever it might be, but it could also cause a domino effect and cause the project to get off of schedule or introduce other variables. But so I guess we try to maintain that relationship, and I guess it's just an understanding that when the system is working, then it's signed off and it's complete.
Very good. Well, that'll be the last word, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. With this month has been that gentleman there, Steve Greenblatt, the head of everything at Control Concepts. How can people get a hold of you, sir?
You can reach me on Twitter at Steve Greenblatt or on LinkedIn at Steve Greenblatt. I'll definitely be at Infocom at the Crestron Touch Panel Design Gallery, so I hope to see everyone there. And I'm actually doing a course on energy management on Thursday at Infocom, so hopefully some people will be in attendance.
Okay, very good. And for that class, you go to the Infocom Show website, which is infocomshow.org, I believe. And sign up for the class. So Doug Santo has been here as well, senior consultant at Shen, Milsom, and Wilke. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Where would you like to point anybody to your website or Twitter feed or what have you?
Sure. Our website is smwllc.com, and my email address is dsanto, SANTO, at the same website.
Okay. Also with us is Steve Samson, Director of Business Development at Crestron. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tim. It's been a pleasure.
All right. And
Thank you all.
Will you be at Crestron Will you be at Infocom this year with Crestron?
Absolutely. I'll be in and around the booth, so please stop by and say hello.
And do you guys already know your booth number?
We do, but I'm sorry I don't have it at the tip of my tongue.
Sorry. No, I should have asked before.
It's just that little one in the corner.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's in the back 40.
And add one.
Oh, thank you. What Extron booth? Sorry. And that troublemaker there is Uncle Richie. Rich Fregosa from Fregosa Design. Where can people find you, good sir?
Twitter at @rfregosa. You can find me on Google+. What else? FregosaDesign.com. And if you want to catch in my musings, occasionally writing at cepro.com. And if you happen to see me walking around the halls at Infocom, I will be there as well. And stop by and say hi to Uncle Richie.
Yay! Actually, that'll be the first time Uncle Richie and I will get to see see each other in real life, so that'll be fun. My name is Tim Albright. Don't follow me; it's silliness. But go ahead and follow the AVNation crew if you would, please. AVNation.tv, AVNation.tv. We're on Facebook and Twitter and the Google Plus and the LinkedIn. We've got a group on LinkedIn where we post everything that we do. This podcast is on the website as well as our weekly AV Week and a plethora of other podcasts. We will be doing a number of these at Infocom, so check us out. We'll be just adjacent to the Hall E entrance. So we'll have a little recording thing set up there. So AVNation.tv. Thanks so much for listening. This has been A State of Control.